we lived through one, because it is my considered opinion that capitalism has already evolved into something different, something that defenders of capitalism would not recognize today as capitalism. When I was growing up, when I was your age, let's say, the great clash was between the left and the right, between those who believed in a decentralized competitive market mechanism by which to organize the distribution of scarce resources amongst competing needs, and those who believed in central planning or some kind of social democracy. Since the 2008 crisis, we have a completely different situation, because capitalism, financialized capitalism, collapsed in 2008. Finance was refloated by central banks that printed mountain ranges of money and did it. But market capitalism has not. For the last 12 years, we have a state economy, state-financed economy, without the central banks, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the Federal Reserve. The whole thing would collapse. So it's an error to even think of this as a market-based system. It's a central bank state-based system with very few corporations that do remarkably well. Look at the way in which the New York Stock Exchange is propped up by 10 companies effectively, and those are feudal fiefdoms. Once you enter Amazon, you exit capitalism, you exit the market. You are inside a thing that is owned by one person, effectively. So we have a kind of techno-feudalism. So the question is no longer whether there is an alternative to capitalism. We live in post-capitalist times. We better select the kind of post-capitalism which is consistent with the survival and flourishing of the species.
Well, obviously, I mean, there are a lot of countries in the world that are practicing a different form of economy than capitalism. That has been sort of true historically as well. So, I mean, you don't need to sort of invent new systems in order to find alternatives to capitalism. I think sort of perhaps what is more reasonable is to talk about different varieties of capitalism. The extent to which you want to have a free and open economy, this extent to which you want the government to own companies or the government to regulate markets where different companies operate. And you can just look around Europe and you're going to find that countries have found a different balance between different type of instruments here. On the one hand, you can look at sort of Nordic countries that tend to be billed as being sort of semi-socialist economies. I mean, my mother country, Sweden, for instance, for a long time portrayed itself as being sort of somewhere between capitalism and socialism. A much better description is basically that we have an economic system which favors a lot private ownership of companies, tough competition, and a lot of competition between different companies within the sector, but where you have the government taxing and spending quite substantially. So the tax level in the North may be a lot higher than you're going to find in many other countries, but that doesn't mean that the government is regulating the economy more than it does in many other countries. It's just that it has found a different balance between dealing with either issues around capitalism or issues about the consequences of capitalism. For instance, on jobs and what happens when labor gets unemployed. How do you promote a gradual increase in the educational level of labor, etc. So there are lots of different varieties just around Europe, and of course, if you cast the net a bit wider and look at the world, you'll find that other countries have found a different balance or a different mix of policy instruments in order to sort of regulate the scope and the role of the capitalist sector. Let me just sort of end with one thing, which is that when we talk about capitalism, we often need to define what it is that we are talking about. I mean, capitalism itself is the response to one question and one question only, which is who is going to own the means of production? I mean, that's the old debate we had in the 19th century between sort of more free economy type of thinkers and more socialist thinkers, like, for instance, Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels. It doesn't necessarily tell you that it's going to be an open, free market, competition-based economy. You may have sort of state capitalist solutions where you have private ownership of firms, but these firms basically have a monopoly on the markets where they operate, and you don't have a governments that try to encourage competition between different companies there.
Well, Julia, look, the human nature has a dark side. We know that from millennia of drama, poetry, tales, art. We do have a dark side, but to think of self-interest as something given, part of our DNA, is a complete mistake. I mean, it's the largest mistake one can make. There is no such thing as human nature. We make it up as we go along. I mean, let's face it, we were beasts in the jungle, and we evolved. What was taken for granted as being the essence of human nature has changed through time. We create ourselves while recreating the world around us. Some of this recreation is dismal because we're destroying the planet. But, we are authors of our own destiny. Yes, there is a dark side, and we need constantly to be vigilant of it. But the dark side is not so much self-interest, because, the very notion of the self changes all the time. Look at the way that social media is pushing people to understand themselves through their social media accounts. So especially young people like you have an obligation not to take for granted anything like human nature, and to try to adapt the world and yourself to your conception of the good life.
Well, yes and no. I mean, greed and selfishness are part of human nature. They have always been with us and are always going to be with us in the future. So I'm afraid the extent to which that we are actually going to be capable of changing human nature is fairly limited. Now, the good news is that people are not just selfish and greedy. Even people that may look as if they are being very greedy at one point are perhaps a lot less greedy, are perhaps generous, benevolent in other circumstances in life. And I think that's the important point, sort of that human beings don't tend to be unitary in the sense that they're only driven by one passion or one sentiment only. They tend to be driven by a lot of different things. The way they behave in one part of life is not necessarily the way they behave in other parts of life. And I think the important part here is that we create economic systems where we don't try to change human beings, but we are incentivizing people to cooperate. That we have sort of an outlook on our economy where we practice the qualities that we know tend to lead to longer term benefits in the future. So for instance, when you do work, you don't just work for your income. You should sort of have more of a spirit of working for others, of doing something which is meaningful for others. And that's basically division of labor and specialization, in the sense that no one of us can create one single good or one single service itself. We need to collaborate with others in order to achieve things. And in that sense, I think sort of the economy is becoming better at promoting type of sentiments and human qualities that we like. When you look at the modern economy today, the way that we integrate across borders with different type of people in different parts of the world, in different time zones, it promotes our ability to cooperate. And I think that is a good thing. Cooperation is a good thing, but cooperation is also going to include sometimes greed and selfishness and other types of qualities that don't come from the better side of angels.